Having started to accumulate aircraft from their slightly reluctant Soviet benefactors in 1949, by June 1950 the Korean People's Air Force possessed 79 Yak-9 fighters, mainly of the P subvariant, 93 IL-10 assault aircraft, and 67 transport trainer and liaison aircraft. The latter category included a handful of Imperial Japanese planes left over from the occupation. The KPAF had been assembled in haste, but seemingly without any great thought about how it would be employed in the coming war. Although North Korean land forces would initially have great success against the scratch alliance of forces that opposed them, their air arm was rapidly and systematically disassembled by American air power. In the absence of serious opposition, things did, however, start quite well for the North Koreans. At 4:10 in the morning, local time, on the 25th of June 1950, a bombardment by 787 guns began across the 38th parallel. Half an hour later, 86,000 North Korean troops made their move under a slate-grey overcast, led by 120 T-34-85 tanks. That overcast prevented combat sorties by the KPAF against the retreating South Korean forces, or their supply lines, but by 1:15 in the afternoon, the clouds began to break up and the IL-10s went into action. Lacking any fighters of their own, the South Koreans were powerless to impede this communist aircraft as they bombed and strafed troop concentrations and strongpoints. At 5 in the evening, half a dozen Yak-9Ps appeared over Kimpo Airport. They attacked the ramp, destroying or damaging 7 of the 8 South Korean trainers arrayed there, and extensively damaging a US C-54 Skymaster. The control tower was put out of action and the base fuel dump was set on fire. With the South Korean forces in disarray, the next day US Ambassador John Muccio ordered the evacuation of all American civilians on 2 Norwegian fertilizer ships that were conveniently docked at Incheon. Simultaneously, US transport aircraft began to arrive from Japan to pick up personnel from Kimpo and Suwon. Protection of the vulnerable cargo planes fell to the F-82 twin Mustangs of the 4th, 68th and 339th Fighter Wings. They first encountered the Yaks at 1:30 in the afternoon on the 26th of June. By this point, the KPAF had deployed some Yaks forward to Sinmac, enabling them to loiter for longer over the battle area. 2 Yaks bounced a pair of twin Mustangs, but the leader opened fire too early and failed to cause any hits before both North Koreans broke off and escaped to the north. Their IL-10s were busy though. They destroyed the railway station in Seoul on the 26th and then repeated the trick at Anyang on the 27th. So far, so good. On the 27th, formations of Yaks and Ilyushins flew ahead of the armoured thrust aimed towards Seoul. Again, the Yaks found twin Mustangs orbiting lazily at 180 knots at low level. This time, though, they would meet more serious opposition. On the previous day, the US pilots had been unclear about whether they had the authority to pursue North Korean aircraft. They had received a rollicking from MacArthur's office about what he perceived as a lack of aggression on behalf of the US pilots. Once again, the Yaks got the drop on the big black twin Mustangs, led by a Yak-11 two-place trainer that was being used as a spotter. One of the Mustangs took hits, but they both dumped their tanks, accelerated, and turned to engage. The twin Mustangs were big, but they also had a lot of power on tap and large wings. Lumbering they were not. In less than 2 minutes, the Yak-11 and 2 Yak-9s had been shot down. The other pair of fighters ran for home. But the action was not done for the day. At 1 in the afternoon, 9 IL-10s flew over Seoul on their way to Kimpo. They were jumped by 2 F-80C Shooting Stars from the 35th Fighter Bomber Squadron. After a hesitation born out of concern that the aircraft might be Fleet Air Arm Fireflies, Lieutenant Robert E. Wayne gunned down 2 of the assault aircraft. His fuel was, however, running low. The Shooting Stars could only ever loiter for 15 or 20 minutes when operating from Japan. But as he bugged out, a second element of Stars joined in, downing 2 more IL-10s immediately and doing sufficient damage to a third one that it crashed on the way home. Unfortunately, these actions made no difference to the end result. Seoul was captured the following day. The KPAF were seemingly emboldened by the chaos that resulted. With Kimpo gone, Suwon became the focus for relief and reinforcement flights. IL-10s managed to slip past the Combat Air Patrol twice on the 28th, destroying a B-26, a twin Mustang, and a C-54 on the apron. Another C-54 was attacked in the landing pattern. It crashed on its return to Ashir. US B-29s were now deployed to bomb marshalling yards and bridges in an attempt to slow the flood of North Korean forces south. NKPAF claims to have intercepted the big bombers on their first missions don't appear to have any grounding in fact. At the crack of dawn on the 29th, 3 IL-10s, escorted by 6 Yaks, attacked Suwon again before the Combat Air Patrol had been established from Japan. The terminal building was wrecked in this strike, but by the time the follow-up attack arrived, F-80s were on station. 2 IL-10s were shot down. Later in the day, 4 F-51 Mustangs were on cap over MacArthur's conference with ROKA commanders when they spotted another flight of IL-10s on their way to Suwon. Scarcely believing their luck, they pounced on the strike aircraft and shot down another 3. The IL-10 was a devastating close air support aircraft, but it hadn't been designed to survive in contested airspace. Losses were therefore horrific when faced with stiff opposition. The IL-10s did, however, manage to strike Incheon that day, sinking several small boats and strafing the railway station. Meanwhile, Yaks were hastily deployed further forward to Kimpo to better improve their coverage. They were just settling in when the superfortresses returned to put the base out of action. The Yaks rose to engage, but they couldn't prevent the B-29s dropping sticks of 500-pound bombs across the base. B-29 defensive fire also downed a Yak, the pilots of which were untrained in such interceptions and failed to lay a glove on the superforts. It was at this stage that MacArthur made a decision that would ultimately ensure the destruction of the first version of the Korean People's Air Force. Up to this point, FIF's comparatively limited tactical air resources had been tasked with close support of troops in contact and air defense of the resupply. NKPAF raids on the base at Suwon and at Incheon put that effort in jeopardy. So MacArthur ordered FIF to take the attack north and destroy the NKPAF at its bases. Although fighters get all the press, this task initially fell to the B-26 invaders of the 3rd Light Bomber Wing. As night fell, the ground crew at the former IJN base at Haizhou near Pyongyang was stowing their aircraft and equipment when 18 invaders swooped in. They plastered the ramp and hangars with fragmentation bombs and then returned to strafe what was left of the parked aircraft. 5 Yaks attempted to take off and defend their base, but 3 of them were smashed by bombs before they could get away. A B-26 gunner shot down one of the others, who was apparently unaware that the American bombers could shoot behind them. 19 Yaks were destroyed in this one raid. 28% of the NKPAF fighter force had thus been destroyed by the end of the 4th day of fighting. The squadron of Yaks at Kimpo picked up their patrols the next day. 2 of them surprised a flight of 8 F-80s, but once again they appear to have underestimated the speed advantage that the jets had. Firing from too far back, they didn't take advantage of their initial position and they were shot down. Haizhou was attacked again by Navy Sky Raiders, Corsairs and Panthers from USS Valley Forge on the 3rd of July. While the piston-engined aircraft worked over the field, the Panthers helped themselves to a pair of Yak-9s that managed to take off. 2 more Yaks and a transport aircraft were destroyed on the ground. So a week into the war, the NKPAF had lost about 40 aircraft in exchange for 2 US tactical aircraft and 3 C-54s destroyed on the ground, plus the ROKAF's 16 trainers. None of this had lessened the North Korean army's momentum, although there was a pause while politically suspect South Koreans in Seoul were rounded up and shot. On the 3rd of July, the T-34s were across the Han River and they were moving south again. Yaks and Ilyushins were once again overhead despite the losses they'd taken. For the first time, they now began to encounter US artillery spotting aircraft, although the slow and nimble Piper L-4s were frustrating targets for the Yaks. In the confusion, though, US ground forces and headquarters were subjected to air attack for the first time in many years. Such was the scale of the offensive that the thin air forces on either side rarely met in the second week of the war. The 3rd week was more eventful, though. The first casualty to air-to-air fighting that week was on the 12th. An L-4 was attacked and shot down by Yaks. Its crew survived with serious injuries. Later that day, the first B-29 loss of the war was inflicted by fighters. The small force of superfortresses was being used singly and in pairs to attack the dispersed North Korean logistics train. A solo superfort was thus attacked by two single-seat Yak-9s and a two-place trainer. One of its engines was shot out and the crew were forced to bail out over the sea. All survived, but two were captured by the North Koreans. The KPAF were apparently rapidly learning how to engage the US bombers, as an invader was also shot up on the 15th and was forced to land at Taichung. On the 19th, the Yaks put over 100 holes in a B-29, wounding the pilot, who nevertheless managed to get his crippled bird back to base. F-80s claimed two more Yaks on the 15th and the 17th. Then on the 19th, they exchanged 3 Yaks for one F-80, which crashed attempted to land following damage it took in the fight. In between these incidents, the KPAF suffered a much more damaging loss, when 8 Panthers from Valley Forge caught the majority of the Heijo-based Yak contingent on the ground. Multiple strafing passes destroyed 14 aircraft outright and seriously damaged another 13, the majority of which would never be repaired. The next day, the Yaks once again tried to bounce an American shooting star formation, about 8 miles north of Taichung. This time they were spotted by another flight of F-80s who shot down one Yak before it could get into position, then ran down the second when it tried to flee. This marked the point at which the North Korean fighter contingent became combat ineffective. Although between 15 and 20 Yaks were still available to them, they had lost the majority of their trained pilots. The very same day, the same kind of damage was meted out to the IL-10s. An alert RF-80A pilot discovered a small dirt strip near Pyongyang. Only partially concealed in the trees were 2 squadrons of IL-10s. F-80s were dispatched and they went to town on the parked aircraft, destroying 14 of the Ilyushins and a twin-engine transport that tried to get airborne during the attack. 7 more IL-10s were damaged and rendered combat ineffective. 18 more IL-10s were destroyed by a raid from the Valley Forge against Yonpo and nearby Sondok on the 20th. By the time that a Mustang raid on Pyongyang on August the 4th destroyed or damaged another dozen Yaks, the KPAF was reduced to just 2 of the fighters. One of these appears to have attempted to attack a B-29 on the 15th of August, and another shot down an L-5 observation aircraft on September the 1st. The IL-10s were also essentially eliminated from the fighting at this stage. Without fighter cover, it was just too dangerous for them to operate over land. They did, however, mount a daring attack on the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Comus on August the 23rd. Spotting the ship at 0700, they dropped to wave-top height and, despite having no training in naval attacks, succeeded in hitting the destroyer with a 50-kilogram bomb that put holes in the hull near the boiler room. The destroyer turned and unleashed a hail of 20mm and 40mm shells that drove the pair of attackers away. That was enough action for the KPAF, though. In the last week of August, the surviving 20 IL-10s, a single Yak, and 23 remaining pilots fled to China. 4 years of work to establish an air force from the intellectual and physical ashes of Japanese occupation was destroyed in 2 months, with very little to show for it. As UN forces regrouped and then counterattacked, it would be the Soviet Union that stepped in to provide some limited air defense. In China, the process of rebuilding the KPAF began. It would return to Korean skies in time. Training of many hundreds of pilots began in China and the USSR almost as soon as their frontline aviators had retreated. So where did it all go wrong for the KPAF? Well, the simple answer is everywhere, although many of the issues were not of its commander's making. Everything about the North Korean campaign was done in haste. Kim was desperate to cross the border and smash the admittedly also grossly corrupt Rhee regime before it could right itself and establish a functioning and militarily competent dictatorship. He also needed to get his reluctant allies in Moscow and Beijing interested, and an outrageous action seemed most effective in that sense. For the KPAF, this meant that it went to war with a small cadre of barely trained pilots, and critically nowhere near enough ground crew and maintainers. The one thing it did have was decent aircraft. Although not jet-powered, the Yak-9P was a perfectly good late-war fighter and was only opposed by Mustangs, twin Mustangs, and on occasion the F-80. The Yak-9 was a good match for the piston fighters when operating over home turf. It was short-ranged, but more agile and well-armed for a patriotic war-era Soviet fighter. Besides their relative inexperience as aviators, the fact that its pilots did so poorly is largely due to 2 other factors. First, the KPAF lacked any sort of air detection capability. They had no radars, and because they only had a few radios and telephones, it was hard to establish networks of spotters to provide raid warning. This issue was compounded by a severe lack of trained and competent ground crew. North Korean bases generated very few sorties, and they were rarely able to put more than 6 or 8 fighters aloft at a time. Had they been able to mass fighters or consistently deploy combat air patrols, then they would likely have suffered far fewer losses to raids on their bases. Only once, in the Navy's first attack on Haejo, did they face an overwhelming mass of UN aircraft. The rest of their casualties were inflicted by small group raids scratched together from what the US had available. Part of the blame rests with the Soviets, who chose to donate a mixed force of Ilyushins and Yaks. In hindsight, although the assault aircraft scored some high-profile successes, the superior commitment and equipment of the Northern Ground Forces was such that the actual military effect of the IL-10s was quite negligible. The impact of losing air superiority was much more significant. A force consisting of Yaks alone might have been more militarily useful. In saying that, it's easy to conclude that there was nothing that the KPAF could have done against US forces once they were committed. I'm not sure that's entirely true. Although FIF had significant on-paper resources at the outset of the fighting, they lacked usable bases on the peninsula, and they only had a small number of aircraft that could actually reach the battlefield. This was why so many F-51s were pulled out of depots and sent to equip F-80 squadrons. They joined Invaders, Superforts, and the Navy's Sky Raiders, Corsairs, and Panthers. It looks like an overwhelming force, but it had a lot of missions to accomplish. Most of these types were tasked for CAS and interdiction, not hunting down enemy fighters. And in the early weeks they were operating from Japan, meaning that sorties were long and crews were tired. Basic things like maps and intelligence about the DPRK forces were of poor quality or simply unavailable. That the US, RAAF and Fleet Air Arm aviators were able to eliminate their opponent and contribute so much in the early part of the conflict says much about the relatively high level of their individual skills and those of their crews that supported them, rather than an inherent numerical superiority. But, of course, the war was far from over, even though it might have looked that way in the fall of 1950.